Well, I am very, very happy today to be here on Blogging Heads TV with Noah Gervais. Um, and we are going to be talking about video gaming, but not perhaps in the way that it's typically discussed. We're going to be talking about video gaming as a form of storytelling, as a way of telling stories. And Noah certainly is somebody who knows a lot about this. So, Noah, it's typical for us to introduce ourselves before we start talking. So, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll do the same.
Sure, I'm Noah Gervais. I produce long form critical content about video games on YouTube, which means that I do videos that are generally 20 minutes to 2 hours in length, sort of breaking down video games. I also do travel videos, and I do it all freelance, just completely on my own, independently of anybody else.
And I am Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University and a video game enthusiast. I should just say before we start that the way that I'm really happy to have Noah here because I am a subscriber to his channel on YouTube and I'm a fan of his work. And this is the reason why I asked you to do this was because of all the video reviewers whose channels I subscribe to, and I subscribe to a number of them. Your reviews are by far the most in-depth, the most thoughtful, and are the most oriented towards the narrative and storytelling side of gaming as opposed to a lot of the other aspects, though you do talk about those aspects too.
Thank you.
Um, so what I thought we'd start with was just the very idea of gaming and storytelling. Now, I had always thought of this, I had this sort of picture in my mind of the history of this, and so I thought, well, for a long time, there were just these things called games, and games were essentially forms of competitive entertainment. And then, magically, in the mid 1970s, this game appeared called Dungeons and Dragons, which changed the nature of gaming and made gaming into a kind of storytelling, or introduced a kind of storytelling into gaming. But then, in a very interesting conversation you and I had, Noah, you had said that you thought that all gaming has always been in part about storytelling. And maybe you could talk a little bit about like that to start us off.
Absolutely. The example that we had talked about two examples, and I want to start off by talking about baseball in terms of narrative and drama, which is really where I learned to look at things that way. I learned it from my dad, and when he took me to Padres games when I was growing up. The thing that people love about baseball, and one of the reasons why it's such a great sport for radio, is that the rhythm of play sets up these dramatic situations with the different players, with the different like strategic elements of play. And because baseball is sort of turn-based in a way, it sets up these dramatic situations. Like when you have the bases loaded, there's an incredible amount of like narrative tension going on. Like how will the next play turn out? Like something has to happen. Similarly, chess, you get a narrative really between the two players. You have the systems in place, the systems that govern the rule of the game. And then you also have the personalities of the two players coming to bear. And especially when you look at like why people are interested in watching other people play competitive chess, it's not only watching the game itself, watching the systems of the game, it's watching these two players have, sort of an interaction and a battle and a narrative within like the context of their own skills and their own mindset. And we think of Dungeons and Dragons as like collaborative storytelling, but there's always been drama and narrative and storytelling in any sort of game. It sets these things up simply because of the personalities working through the systems of the game.
So let me ask you just a little bit about this, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons. But just on this particular topic, so is the idea sort of the idea you gave of baseball? It seems to me like the strongest element or the strongest perception of narrative and of story is from the perspective of the spectator, right? Um, but it seems to me that would you say that also there is an element of being in a narrative for the player, or do you think in other words, is that the thing that's going to sort of change with Dungeons and Dragons and with the video gaming, and that is that the player now is experiencing the gaming as storytelling, or do you think it's always been both the player and the spectator?
I I think that Dungeons and Dragons is much more collaborative than baseball. You know, baseball is a spectator sport, and the drama all comes from what other people are doing while they're actually playing the game, and that's really fun to watch and really interesting to see. But it's really only playing it that you get to experience it yourself, and you know, there's not always a lot of opportunities to do that. Like, of course, there's, you know, local intramural teams, but you never quite get the drama of baseball unless you're watching, you know, really serious players do it, or you have the opportunity to do it, which is really not that rare. It takes a lot of people to get a baseball game going. Dungeons and Dragons is less. All you have to do is like 4 or 5 or 6 people, and then video games, of course, you know, moving a little bit ahead, only take one person and then the computer to get that experience of participating in play and participating in the drama.
So you do think that in the case of like the baseball, I think your dog is very excited.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. There's not a lot I can do.
So you are saying that in the case of a game like baseball, the experience of a narrative or of story and of drama is experienced both by the spectators watching the game and by the players playing the game.
Absolutely. The systems of the game are the things that create the drama, and then the players experience it as a participant, and the spectators experience it as a spectator. But it's the interaction of players within the system, within the game, that creates the drama, that creates these tense situations and these narrative situations.
Right. Okay, so we can already look at gaming as providing an experience that at some level is like the experience of narrative and of storytelling with drama and I guess even with characters. I mean, you know, I was just watching. It's funny you mentioned baseball. I was a tennis player, a competitive tennis player, and I just watched last night an incredible documentary on Netflix about Jimmy Connors. I think it's called This Is What They Want, and it was about Connors' comeback in 1991 when he was 38, 39 years old, attempt to come back and win one more U.S. Open, and he had this incredible U.S. Open run where I think he went all the way up to the semifinals. And what struck me so much was not just that there was such a story here in the sense of a narrative, but also that there were characters, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that, you know, Connors was very much a character. The people he played were very much characters. And I guess that's also true, I guess, in pro sport and all other pro sports, is that, and even in games like chess, right? Kasparov is definitely a character.
Yeah.
I guess I just never thought of ordinary games that way, but now that you say it, of course, that's correct. And I guess that's a lot of the appeal, don't you think?
Oh, it's absolutely a lot of the appeal. But in a lot of ways, the stories that they're telling aren't like literary stories, particularly. Like, they don't have a lot of the same elements of like fiction that Dungeons and Dragons has. It's sort of all about the personalities and all about the systems. And when you look at like competitive video games like StarCraft, that's definitely the same way. There's the game, and then there's the skill of the player and like their preferences and the way they choose to play it. And the thrill of it is always in the interaction between, you know, sort of what can you accomplish in the game, and what specific personalities like prefer accomplishing in the game. And when you put them head to head, just what happens in the interaction of all of those things. It's so unpredictable. Like, the systems keep the interplay between the personalities really unpredictable. Like, when you get a game with Dungeons and Dragons, like, a lot of the rule systems that, like, when you look at it from the outside, seem so silly. Like, oh, roll a d20 to open the door. Like, if you just say, oh, I opened the door, and the dungeon master says, oh yeah, okay, you opened the door, you know, that there's no drama in that. There has to be a certain element of
a chance of failure.
And so all of these systems in Dungeons and Dragons put systems of potential failure and consequence and unintended consequence into storytelling that might not otherwise have this random element that's so critical in like regular games.
All right, so let's since we're talking about, let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons and how things change with Dungeons and Dragons. And we really cannot assume that anyone watching this has played Dungeons and Dragons. No. Although I'm sure that there are some, but so we probably need to talk a little bit about what the game is, and what about it is different from games as they existed before. So Dungeons and Dragons, I guess, comes out around 1974, and it actually comes out of an earlier game called Chainmail, which was a purely tactical sort of game where the idea was, just to sort of combat between two teams or several teams, or combat through a pre-made scenario where the focus was entirely on tactics and on fighting. But D&D comes out of that, and in the mid 70s, and really is sort of established in the game that we now know by the late 70s. After which it then went through one sort of iteration after another in terms of changes of rule sets. How would you characterize, if you were to try and give to a layperson a description of Dungeons and Dragons, how would you characterize it? And specifically from the storytelling aspect, in what way did it do something in what way did it tell stories that games previously hadn't?
Dungeons and Dragons allows for collaborative storytelling of sort of more traditional, like novel-like plots, basically. So what you have is you have one person playing the role of the dungeon master, and they're responsible for describing the world and describing the incidental characters that you meet, basically relaying the story. The dungeon master is the storyteller, but they're also the rule master. They control the dice and that sort of thing. And then everyone else involved in the game is a player. They create a character with certain, like, strengths and weaknesses, which get rated on sort of a numeric scale with things like attributes and skills. And the players all go off of what the storyteller tells them, but then they control their character. They're responsible for deciding how they wish to react to the story, and then the dungeon master reacts to them. So within, like, regular games, you have the systems themselves, and then you interact within the systems. But Dungeons and Dragons is unique because it's a series of systems that you can apply in a more general way to whatever you can come up with in your imagination. And, like, it's specifically tooled for a fantasy setting. But there are many other tabletop role-playing games, like GURPS, Steve Jackson's GURPS, which stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System, which are meant to be applied to literally anything that you can come up with at all. So what you have with Dungeons and Dragons that's really different is that you're taking the game systems and game systems which are meant to create dramatic tension, and then applying actual, like, dramatic creativity on top of it, applying stories and character. And the thing that people really love about it, of course, is that this is collaborative with your friends. You're doing this with a bunch of people that you like, and you get to experience your friends' creativity in this way too. So not only do you get a chance to, like, really get into the dwarf mage that you're playing, but you get to see what your buddy comes up with, and you play together against a common thing. So unlike chess, where when you play with your buddy, there's a winner and a loser. There's no real traditional winners and losers. There's the plot and how you choose to interact with the plot, and then the dungeon master's job is to basically make it coherent and keep it moving forward.
Right. So in Dungeons and Dragons, what you really have is you have something akin to the sorts of scenarios that you find in novels,
Yeah.
And in films. And so, pick your favorite fantasy novel, let's say Lord of the Rings. So imagine the story, the plot line of Lord of the Rings. And what the game involves is several people literally inhabiting characters that are a part of that story. And the dungeon master, or as we used to call him, the game master, would controls the rule systems, and also is the one who's narrating the story to the players and describing the world around them, as you said. And what's amazing about it is that because the players inhabit characters that are part of the story, how the story unfolds and what the story turns out to be is partly determined by the players.
Yeah, that's
and so in that sense, it's almost like an interactive novel, right?
Very, very much so. And that's something that's entirely unique to Dungeons and Dragons. Video games have sort of been chasing this and are still chasing this, but there's there's no limit to the imagination. So if you have a lot of imaginative people all playing Dungeons and Dragons at the same time, there's really no way of determining how the story will turn out. And as a dungeon master, that can be kind of frustrating, actually, right? So you write like this whole big story, but if the players don't choose to pay attention to the things that you've written, you've got to come up with something else. Like
Yeah.
it's basically Dungeons and Dragons is meant to accommodate both the imaginations of the players and the dungeon masters, and it's the players that are really driving it forward. So whatever the players decide to do, the dungeon master has to react and make the
Right.
plot conform to it. Which is what's so much fun about it. Like I said, it allows for the unexpected to creep in, and things that are unexpected to even the storyteller, which is fun.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it really. I mean, to go in a little bit of detail about this. I mean, the way that this works is that one, as a game master, one can either buy adventures that are already pre-made, which is almost like buying pre-written novels
Yeah,
with empty slots that you can then put these characters and players into and navigate them through, or you can create your own. Now, I was a game master for about 10 years, and so with a single group.
oh wow.
And so by the end, we were playing the grandchildren of our first rounds of
That's
characters.
so cool.
And I created the game universe. I created all the adventures and missions that they went on. And so what's amazing about it also is the level of immersiveness that you can accomplish. I know anybody who's really into reading knows how immersed you can get into a good book, and to the point to which you almost feel a little bit like you're in the world
Yeah,
that the book is painting for you. But in a novel, you're always a passive spectator. What's amazing about Dungeons and Dragons is that if the game master is really good and the game world is really well designed, and the other players are really into it, and as you said, are imaginative, the level of immersiveness into the storytelling is just, I think,
yeah,
unmatchable by almost any other kind of narrative
yeah.
experience.
No, I
No.
definitely agree.
One other thing we should maybe say, just because these are things that are going to get imported into the video games we're going to talk about, is that the characters that players inhabit are drawn to quite a degree of depth. In other words, it's not just that your character is of a certain class, so you're either a fighter or you're a wizard or you're a thief, but and that those different classes have different attributes that determine how good they are at the various things they do. They also have what are called alignments,
Yeah,
which means, which in D&D speak, what alignments are is your basic sort of moral template, moral disposition. So are you a lawful character? That is a character who tends to follow the rules. Are you a chaotic character? A character that tends to be more anarchic. Are you a good character? Are you an evil character? And these all mix together in different combinations to allow for very, very complex and even subtly different styles of character play.
yeah,
Yeah. All right, so let's talk now about how. And by the way, the name of this genre is role playing.
yeah.
I mean, it's not. It's a very, what it's called is exactly what it is. And so for people who find this whole kind of gaming alien, I think one of the things, if you really want to imagine what it's like, the closest thing it's like is when you and your friends, when you were little kids, engage in imaginative play.
Yeah,
When you were either playing cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians or superheroes or whatever. It's like that, but with a rule set, right?
exactly. So, like in Cops and Robbers, you get into it where it's like, you shot me. No, you didn't. Yeah, I did. I
Right,
mean, the
right,
dice eliminate all of that. You shot me.
right. The
Did
dice,
you?
you got shot, right? And I rolled the dice, and you took
Yeah.
10 points of damage, and you're almost dead, right?
Exactly. So it's a way of
Um,
keeping track of this in a way where that's really impartial to the players and to the dungeon
yeah,
masters.
and that actually, I should say, from a narrative perspective, makes it more realistic. It makes you feel like you really are in a world and not just making stuff up as you go
Yeah.
along. That sort of rule set, in a sense, makes the world objective in a
Yeah.
way. even though the whole thing is invented, it makes it objective in a way that makes the experience much more realistic than when you're just playing and you just change the rules and make up things as you go along.
Yeah,
So
because then when you
yeah,
take risks in the game, they really are risks. Like there's a chance of
right,
failure.
right. Okay, so let's get now to video gaming. So video games existed. Um, in other words, video games in terms of games that you played in the arcade existed at the same time the Dungeons and Dragons came out. But the types of games that you played in video arcades were really more of the pre D&D type of game, except in a video framework, in a video
Yeah.
format. Um, but what we want to talk about are the video games that got made for the home market. First, I guess for computers, and then later also for various consoles like Xbox and PS and all
Yeah.
that sort of stuff, PlayStation, all that. But the games whose effort, what they were trying to do was to try to replicate the Dungeons and Dragons experience, that very storytelling, narrative heavy type of experience, into video gaming. So maybe you could start us off about how you see that transition when video gaming started trying to do what you do in Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely. I think we should start off talking about Baldur's Gate because it's
Sure.
based literally off of Dungeons and Dragons. It's a licensed property within a setting called the Forgotten Realms, which fantasy author R.A. Salvatore wrote dozens and dozens of novels for, along with many others. So the thing that Baldur's Gate tries to do is basically to automate the process of the dungeon master, to make it so that a single player can get the same sort of immersive, dynamic experience that they can get from a tabletop setting with a bunch of friends and a dungeon master, but just on demand, whenever they want, from this program, from the game. So the game is formatted where you have a party consisting of yourself and the character that you create, and then 5 other characters. I believe it's 5. It's a 6-person party in Baldur's Gate, right?
I believe so,
Yeah.
yes. Although it doesn't, you don't have to. In other words, I think that's the max.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
the max.
yeah,
But
yeah.
so as you go through the story, you meet other characters who offer to come along with you, and then you can keep them, and then you can arrange your party either tactically for a balance of skills and a balance of like strengths and weaknesses between the characters, or you can create a party that like conforms to your character in terms of alignment and values, so that when you go through the game, you don't anger any of these non-player characters. And the way in which you would get into a situation where you would anger them is that to express yourself in sort of the dynamic way that you might at a real tabletop setting. Every time you're in dialogue, when the conversation goes back to the player character, you get a list of, back then it was generally between 3 and 7 dialogue choices, indicating different attitudes and opinions, or like questions to ask or demands to make. And sometimes these would change depending on your skill. Like if you have a very high, I don't know if Baldur's Gate necessarily did this, but other role-playing games frequently do, where you have skill checks or attribute checks, where if you have a particularly high perception, you might get an extra option to like notice something and comment on it, or if you have a high charisma, you might be able to charm them in a way that other characters might not. But the point is that you're given a wide range of possible responses to the conversation, and then the game reacts to that. The next line of dialogue you get is specifically tailored to your previous response. So the conversation flows organically from these trees of various sorts of input and response. They're called dialogue trees. Dialogue trees are sort of the basis of a lot of role-playing games and sort of the Western role-playing game genre in general. But the idea behind it is to, in miniature and on demand, replicate this experience. But it's not quite there because the program has no imagination. So its depth of response is completely limited to what the programmers were able to put in the game. And that's the real challenge for role-playing in a video game format, is that a game will only ever have the dynamic response that they were able to afford to put into it and able to implement within the technology that they were using. And so when you go back to Baldur's Gate, it's an isometric game, which means that you have a view from sort of very high in the air, and you look down and you see the buildings and you see your character, and you see sort of a tactical overhead view of everything that's going on. Um, and in terms of technology, this isn't really very demanding. So you can put a lot of complexity into the writing, into the dialogue choices, into implementing the rule systems of D&D. And Baldur's Gate 1 uses Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is a really complicated system.
Yeah.
And just, you know, the way that they integrate all of these things, they're integrated incompletely, but there's really no way to wholly incorporate Dungeons and Dragons into a program that can't think for itself.
Right. So one of the things we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about some of the limitations and weaknesses of this first generation of attempts to capture in the video medium what was done, what was achieved in the tabletop, as a way of sort of talking about how the games evolved. But let's just for a minute just stay on the first generation. So Baldur's Gate, I actually wrote these things down because I didn't want to have to sort of start groping for when these things. So the first Baldur's Gate comes out in 1998. And so this is already 20 years after Dungeons and Dragons. It's already after you went through the late 70s and 80s when video games in the arcade became a huge cultural phenomenon. And when also video gaming at home became a big cultural phenomenon through things like the Atari home game system, ColecoVision, and several others. And then by the time you get to the 90s, the technology is now up to snuff, and the computer AIs are up to the level that you can actually start trying to replicate the tabletop role-playing game experience in the computer. And just a few things I would add with respect to the Baldur's Gate style play. The Baldur's Gate type of games, and we should also mention that it's not the only one, but it's the most well-known franchise, and it is directly out of Dungeons and Dragons, so it's certainly the best one to talk about. What's amazing about it is that I don't know if people will quite understand unless we make it really explicit, is that you can talk to the other computer-generated characters.
Oh yes.
Right. In other words, you control your party in the sense that you equip the computer-controlled characters that are in your group, and but when you talk to them, the computer controls their answers, right? And when you said that you could run the risk of angering your teammates, the idea is something like, well, if one of your teammates is a lawfully good paladin, so that's a character with a very, very good and rule following alignment, and you start running around a town killing everybody randomly, which you can do, right? The computer will tell you that the guy is angry, and he'll start telling you he's angry, and he may even leave the party, or he may even attack you, right? And so the game really did to a very sort of high level, certainly given the time, really did simulate the role-playing experience of playing actual Dungeons and Dragons without having to have any other people other than the computer AI. Where do you, and I should also say that the storytelling was very good. That is, that in the Baldur's Gate series, and then they also produced another series that was in the D&D universe called Icewind Dale. Which was the same type of game,
but more tactical
for the most
focused.
part. But more tactical. But nonetheless, I mean, the stories were really good, and the world that they created was really good. And so it was like playing Dungeons and Dragons with a really good dungeon master who knew how to create a good story. And the computer AI was pretty good at creating memorable sidekicks for you to run with memorable character personalities.
Yeah, very, very much so.
So where do you see, in what ways would you say, though, that first generation of game was limited in terms of replicating the Dungeons and Dragons experience, and in terms of more generally the storytelling aspect of gaming?
They're limited in scope, and they're limited in the amount of choices that a player can make. In an actual tabletop setting, the amount of choices that you make is limited only by your imagination. But in a role-playing game like Baldur's Gate, and really beyond, this problem has been like sort of gradually worked on over time, but it certainly hasn't ever been solved. That because of the expense of creating games, like the amount of man hours necessary to create a game is huge. Um, the player is limited to basically only the places where they've created hinges for the story, and even then, only where the story hinges to. So say you get into a quest and you have an option to either kill someone or not. That's a binary choice. And as a player in a tabletop setting, like there's a lot that you could do. You could argue with a person, you could negotiate, you could blackmail, like anything that you come up with, you can have in this interaction with this character. But in a game, the game has to accommodate whatever the player actually ends up choosing. So they limit it. Generally speaking, they usually limit choices to binary choices, like do or do not do this thing that we've presented you with, because then they can respond to it from either table A of possible responses or table B of possible responses. Like everything that the game reacts with had to be programmed in. So all of these story hinges and all of the ways that the story can change over time is kind of modular. Like what's going on is not that the computer is coming up with something to respond to you with, it's swapping in a module in which they've already anticipated the choice that they've given you. So if you kill the guy, they'll load in all of the further choices that involve that person being dead. And if you don't kill the guy, then they load in all of the possible responses that involve that person being alive. So it's really hard, really hard to accommodate for player agency in a way that doesn't create an impossible workload for the writers.
Right. In other words, for every alternative possible choice that a player might make, either in dialogue or in action, you then have to, in a sense, produce, in terms of actual production, an entirely separate line of consequence that follows from that line of choice.
Yeah,
so there's a sheer programming problem, or not a problem, but a programming issue. It's simply labor intensive and it's resource intensive.
Yeah.
Every single addition. But there's a further point, and I think that this is something that is going to allow us to sort of branch out our discussion to talk about some types of games other than this traditional RPG genre. There's also the issue of the advancing of the storyline. In other words, in a tabletop situation, the dungeon master has literally indefinitely many ways of keeping the characters on the storyline, right? And so, in other words, he can make sure that characters stay on the storyline without doing so in a way that seems unnatural, almost like you're on a ride,
Yeah.
right? Like you're on a preset, What in the gaming business we call it this on the rails, right? And so there's a double issue. One issue is, gosh, how much money and resources do I have to create more and more possible choices? And that's a matter of expense. But there's a further problem. The more choices that I offer the player, the more chances the player is going to choose combination of choices that I didn't foresee would break the storyline, right? And so there's the further problem of how you advance the story in a way so that the player feels like it's natural. The player really does feel like he's contributing. But on the other hand, he can't contribute so much that he can break the story, right?
Yeah, it's a tricky balance, and each game actually has to figure out how they want to approach that. And that's why you get different studios which get sort of different reputations about how they handle these sorts of things, because each of them has a different sort of philosophy about how to balance the balance.
Right. And so maybe at this point, it's worth at least introducing the two other types of games that we're going to talk about And then in that context, we can then come back to talking about what the next generation of this type of game was after Baldur's Gate, which is going to be, we're going to talk about Mass Effect.
Yeah.
But I think maybe before we do that, it's worth, in a sense, providing a little context. And so maybe we could just, for a few minutes, just talk about the two other types of video games that we're going to look at. So one type was a type of game in which you inhabit a faceless, you inhabit a character that really that never speaks, a silent protagonist, and you are very much on a linear, on the rails story. In other words, there are no choices in the sense that we just described. Um, um, but because you inhabit this character, and these games are typically in the first person, they're typically what are called first person shooters. I'm thinking specifically about games like Half-Life and System Shock. There's if the story is well designed, it can be very immersive.
Very.
Even though there isn't this collaborative element, there are no choices. There really aren't. There may be dialogue, but it's completely preset. So that's one kind, and then the other kind on the other side of what we're talking about, which are classic RPGs. On the other side of that is the opposite, a completely open world experience where there isn't much by way, or a very minimal actual plot, and what's really being provided is a world, right? And these games are sometimes referred to as sandboxes, right? And what's great about those is there, in a sense, the player has maximum ability to make choices, because the game doesn't have such a strict plot to stick to.
Yeah.
In other words, it doesn't have to make you do certain things, because the story is relatively minimal. It's happy to just let you make your own story in the sandbox.
Yeah.
So would you say that that's a good way of describing three different ways of telling stories in video games?
I definitely would agree. Like there's more genres than that, but as far as what we're going to talk about today, those definitely are. Before we talk about open world games, I think we should definitely talk about linear first person shooters, because in a lot of ways, open world games are kind of a hybridization of the gameplay techniques of the first person genre and the storytelling techniques of the role playing, the traditional role playing.
Right. So then, given that now the audience has this sort of context, at least roughly, of three different types, let's just finish talking out the type we've been talking about, which is the direct descendants of Dungeons and Dragons, and then we can talk about the other two types. So there are these Baldur's Gate did a very good job, and its generation did a very good job of trying to approximate the D&D experience in the video game medium. However, it did have a number of limitations, and some of these were technological. And some of these, I think you had said to me in a private conversation that you thought that some of the limitations were also that they were trying to replicate the D&D experience too literally, and that in a sense they didn't realize that in order for the experience to translate into the video medium, they would have to change some of the mechanics.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about the next generation of games, maybe the games like Mass Effect, in terms of that sort of progression of the game design.
Absolutely. Mass Effect is a trilogy of games that came out within the last 7 years or so. Was it?
Yeah, the first one, I wrote this down. The first one was 2008. The second one was 2010. And then the third one, I think, was just a few years ago.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that these are made by the same company that made Baldur's Gate.
Yes.
BioWare. Not a whole lot of the same people, but the same company. So it's very much a part of Baldur's Gate legacy. Mass Effect does role-playing in a less complicated way, but in a way that's a little more visceral. And they do this by sort of winnowing down all of these, myriad choices and trying to replicate like the total player agency of the tabletop into 3 and then increasingly just 2 paths that allow you to have sort of a different philosophical approach for your character. And they call these Paragon and Renegade. And what's really interesting about it is that they're not traditional good and evil. If you're playing a Paragon character, the choices that you're generally making are ones that support diplomatic solutions, that are compassionate, even when they're not pragmatic. So you can make choices that are strategically bad, but humanitarian, like good from a humanitarian perspective, and that's the Paragon path. And then Renegade, it isn't evil. The plot outcome of Mass Effect, like the big goings on of the plot, happen really whether you choose Paragon or Renegade. It's Paragon or Renegade determines more the tone of your reaction to it.
Right.
Renegade is about solving the problem and damn the cost, basically. So it's about valuing strategic might and necessity completely over any kind of like preference or feelings or human need, or it's sci-fi, so alien need otherwise. Basically, whatever it takes to get the job done, that's your Renegade character. And you can play it by choosing a mix of these responses. All of these responses are always open to you at any time, and you can do a hybrid choice of response depending on like how you want to play your character. So
although hold on, let me just interrupt for a second. Although I will say, I mean, it's sophisticated enough to the point to which the more you consistently choose to make choices or to give dialogue choices or to engage in actions that reflect either the Paragon or Renegade personality, the deeper you go into that and the more you are characterized more as a Renegade or more as a Paragon, you actually get additional dialogue options that would not be open to you before.
Yeah.
As in a sense, you become more and more of that type. And so it does even allow for a little depth within. It's not purely binary, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you play a generally mixed character that sometimes makes Paragon, sometimes makes Renegade choices, you may never get some of these dialogue options.
Oh, yeah.
That you get if you really play heavily as a Renegade or heavily as a Paragon.
Yeah, they definitely make it so that if you're consistent in your approach, you're able to be like that. You have even more options within that. And the reason they did it this way, in my opinion, is so that they can sort of try to control and correct for the difficulties presented by giving a player agency within a story that has, sort of a predetermined outcome. So the plot of Mass Effect is actually really, really, really great across all three games. But
it's like being in Star. I mean, it is at the level of Golden Age science fiction of Asimov and Heinlein, and of more, in terms of film, in terms of Star Wars and Star Trek. I mean, they really, I think, the mechanics. I mean, we're talking about the way that mechanics facilitate storytelling and immersion, but if you here, the story is so amazing and the characters are amazing and the universe is so well realized that it makes the immersion, it makes the experience just absolutely. I think I can't think of any other game that the experience is at that level of quality.
Yeah, me neither. And the one way that Mass Effect, I think, succeeds over Baldur's Gate is in the player's party. Like particularly in Baldur's Gate 1, you actually get a lot of different options for who you want in your 6-person party. And some of them are pretty compelling and some of them are kind of flat. But for Mass Effect, all of the characters are not only fully voiced, but they're also fully articulated within conversation, so that when you have a conversation with a character, like they'll sort of move around the room and you can see the expressions on their face change in real time.
Yeah, they emote.
Yeah, they emote. And like that's one of the things that the technology has really, really improved on is expressiveness of characters and the ability for game artists to really convey nonverbal information. Like the ability for games to convey nonverbal storytelling is just way better than it used to be. So much better. And Mass Effect was really a pioneer. In 2008, when the first one came out, like graphically speaking, it was a knockout.
And in Baldur's Gate, this would all have to be done with text.
Yeah, all of it
because the visuals were so rudimentary that you couldn't. you couldn't communicate anything about the character's reaction or about another person's reaction through visual, through their facial expression, through you had to write it all in text. So it was a little bit almost like reading being in an interactive novel.
Yeah,
But here, the graphical quality is so high and the animations are of such high quality that it really does become like a virtual real experience.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
it's great. Mass Effect is just incredible. So what you get really is, to get this immersive storytelling, it's a synthesis of all sorts of things that the game is doing. It's a synthesis of the aesthetics and the art design, and Mass Effect actually does have a really unique sort of visual composition for what their vision of the future is supposed to be like. It's really unique. Um, it has character-based storytelling with characters that actually move and speak, and like voice actors do such a good job in this game. They really, really
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
And then you have the player agency that gets accommodated into the game. And what's really unique about Mass Effect, like even among other role-playing games, and is that your choices from previous games are incorporated into the next games. So characters that died in Mass Effect 1, when you start your Mass Effect 2 playthrough with the same character, all of those choices are imported. Characters that died in the first game do not appear in the second game, or characters that you helped in the first game will thank you in the second game, and things like that. And it's again, this is something that's incorporated kind of incompletely, but the ambition is really fantastic. And for the sort of limited ways in which they did incorporate this, basically like 5 or 6 big deal, like capital letter choices and story hinges made it in, like, keep going into the second and third games, and then like 3 or 4 dozen like tiny little details. So it's not literally every decision that you make in the first game that gets carried over. It's just sort of a few key things and then a bunch of minor stuff. But it's still really amazing, and it gives you this sense of continuity that I've never really felt before. Like, your character from the first game really is the same one in the second game and the same one in the third. And I like to do a thing where I have my characters grow older in a series if they do that. So I managed to, for like my favorite playthrough of it, have my character start off being like sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and have him just get older and tireder and just more weary as the series progresses. And it's really fun to play it that way. And that's the fun of it, is that however you want to do it, the game gives you options to do it. So you'll, in a book, like occasionally you'll enjoy the protagonist, but you'll be like, that's dumb, I wouldn't do that. In the game, if you want to say, that's dumb, I wouldn't do that, you can choose from the other options and select something that you think is more appropriate.
Right. So this actually seems like maybe a good way to sort of segue over. So one of the things you just said caught my attention, and that is that in terms of the carryover, so the decisions you make in the first game, the people the people you save, the people you kill, even some of the things you say to people, then when you import that character into the next game where the story continues, because the story arc goes over the entire 3 games, it's a single story arc. All that carries on, which of course increases the realism and increases the immersion, and also increases the sense of collaborative storytelling. The idea that I'm making this story as well as the game makers. However, as you also pointed it out, it's relatively limited. And part of the reason it's relatively limited is because of the technology and the cost. But a more important reason why it's limited is that although this type of game is collaborative, there is a definite linearity in the sense that you are still on a rail. There is a place the story has to go, and so the choices you make all have to, in the end, wind up pointing to a finite number of places. Otherwise it breaks. And the reason why I think this is a nice place from which to segue is that's really the point at which the 3 different models differ, right? They differ as to how much on the rails the story is, what type of experience that gives you, and therefore what type of mechanics are required. So in a sense, the one we've just described is a kind of a middle way. It's somewhat collaborative in the sense that players are partly making the story, but it's also partly on the rails in the sense that there is a definitive, very substantial, specific story, such that whatever choices you make, they ultimately have to at least end in a finite number of similar
Yeah.
places. So maybe now we'll cross over to the other two. Which one did you want to discuss first?
Well, let's talk about linear shooters and the first-person genre.
Okay. So actually, these actually are a little earlier. These start a little earlier than the Baldur's Gate. The first System Shock is 1994, and the first Half-Life is the same year as Baldur's Gate. So why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about those and how those tell stories in a different way than the types we've just been talking about.
Well, we had talked a little bit in one of our previous conversations about things that games do uniquely from books and movies, and
yes,
being able to effectively use a first-person perspective is one of those things. Like you rarely see it in movies. You see it a lot in books, but it's not a participatory sort of first person. In terms of like storytelling in novels, while the literal perspective is first person, the storytelling that's going on is second person, as you had pointed out to me, and I've just fallen in love with that idea since you mentioned it to me. Like, it really is second person storytelling that's going on in a first person game. So let's use Half-Life as an example. So in Half-Life, you're in the shoes of a research associate at this giant government facility, and you're running late, and like the first 25 minutes of the game is basically all of your coworkers like chiding you for being late as you're running along to the test chamber to complete this test. And then the test that you complete destroys the barrier between dimensions, and aliens start flooding in, the structure starts collapsing, like hell breaks loose. It's phenomenal. And so the story puts you in the shoes of this average person and then says, there's a disaster, what are you going to do about it? And so all of the storytelling that happens, it's not done through like cutscenes. They never take you out of the perspective of your character. You're in this guy's shoes at all times, and like you don't really even perceive them as being their own character. They're silent, they don't speak. What these games give you the opportunity to do as a player is to react without barrier, without even really the barrier of character. In Half-Life, you experience the story directly. It's everything you do is reactive, everything you do is visceral, and like in a movie or a book, like the pacing would be just brutal and terrible. Like you can't have in a book or movie a thing that describes literally every footstep of a character doing the things that they're doing, like unless you're in an Irish novel. But like
that's good.
The games can, because like the drama and tension is really in any given moment, because at any given moment you're deciding what to do and how to do. And so in first-person games, storytelling is done a lot less by characters and more by level design. So they'll craft these environments in a way where it makes you feel like you're figuring it out, but they're sort of directing you in a particular flow and like a particular direction through environments. So it feels like a process of organic discovery, but really it's being sort of funneled into a specific experience. So it's creating that illusion. And when people talk about like, oh, this game's good and this game's bad, a lot of times they're talking about how convincing the illusion of player agency is in a linear first-person game. But there's so much going on with that perspective, and there's such a satisfaction of that perspective. Like in a movie, in like a shootout scene, you have to do so much to like sort of show the dramatic tension. And like, you know, do you want to do quick cuts? Do you want to do slow cuts?
Right.
But with a game, the tension is all about, you know, how do you want to handle it? Like around these corner are 3 dudes that are trying to kill you. What are you going to do about it? So all of the tension is figuring out like, well, when I poke my head around the corner, literally, what am I going to do about it? And so then you figure it out.
That's really interesting. The thing about first and second and third person is really interesting. And it's true, you know, when you read a novel that's written in the first person, if it's done really well, you might have the experience of inhabiting someone else's consciousness, right? Yeah. But it's not you,
no.
Right? It's not you experiencing the narrative. It's you experiencing someone else experiencing the narrative. So from your standpoint, it's third person, right? Now, there are very few novels, because this is very tricky to do, that are written in the second
Yeah.
person. The one that I'm thinking of that's the most probably well done is a book by Jay McInerney called Bright Lights, Big City. And what writing in this novels written in the second person do is, in a sense, put the reader into the story.
That's what they're,
It's
yeah.
you doing these things. It's the reader doing these things. And so the reader then experiences the story from a first person perspective.
Yeah.
And what these first person shooters do, um, if what these first person shooters like Half-Life do, is they, like you said, replicate almost a second person novel reading experience, but with the added immersive effect of course, the video full video realization of the
Yeah.
environments, and also the putting you in the position of having to make the actions.
Yeah. But we didn't intend to talk about it, but let me spend like 30 seconds talking about Alien Isolation.
Yeah, sure.
Alien Isolation.
This is which is a new
yeah,
game,
it's
right?
it's a new game. It came out just last year. That takes the original Alien movie, the one where it's just Sigourney Weaver on the ship with just the one alien, and tries to replicate the experience. They don't deliberately replicate the plot. They don't they pull influence from it, but it's very much doing its own thing. But what they've done is that they've created like the most amazing cat and mouse I've ever seen. Like Alien Isolation is a game that tries its damnedest and succeeds to make you feel like a prey animal. And in the original movie, they did that with just such careful editing. Like there's literally nothing wasted in Alien. But in Alien Isolation, it's not a 2-hour movie, it's like a 25-hour game. So how do you deal with the time compression difference of like keeping the same sort of tension and horror over 25 hours that you have compressed into a 2-hour movie? And you do that by giving the player agency, by giving the artificial intelligence the ability to react to what the player is doing. So as you move through these environments, the alien will hunt you, and then you're given all of these tools to distract it with. Like you're given flares and noisemakers and things like that. So like, say you're at like a T intersection, you might like throw a flare down the corridor you're not going down and then go around the other one and just hope that the alien goes after the flare and not after you. But you don't know. You have no way of knowing how the alien is going to react to you. And the artificial intelligence is so good that it actually like learns your tricks after a while. So the time compression is different. The presentation is completely different, but the feel of it, the feel of being hunted, of being terrified, of being a prey animal for once, like is the same. So like the and it's really the first person perspective that does it. Like when you die in the game, like you might get ambushed from behind and like suddenly your character will stop. Like the perspective will look down and you've got this big alien tail coming out of your massive wound in your chest and you're like, shit. You just get wrecked. It's great.
Yeah. So the thing about this, though, from a storytelling perspective, is so much of the work in terms of the effectiveness of immersion in the story is simply because of the first person perspective and because of the level design.
Yeah.
But of course, it also then whether how good the experience is from a storytelling perspective depends a lot on the quality of the writing, the quality of the story itself,
very much
right?
so.
The quality of the plot. In a game like in the previous types of game we were talking about, even if the plot is a little bit weaker or doesn't quite have as much, enough of the actual content is being generated by player decisions, that it doesn't matter as much. But in these first-person shooters, you have no character statistics. You have no sort of ability to affect what the personality of the character is. You are just a silent protagonist in the first-person perspective in this environment. And so you rely entirely on the quality of the writing.
Entirely. And that's really why they use the silent protagonist, is to make it a purely reactive experience. When you have a character that doesn't speak, they also won't contradict the experience of the player in any way at any time. So whatever the player feels about the situation, whatever the player is experiencing personally, they can just project it onto this blank slate of a character.
Right, right. Okay, so let's. I'm aware of time. I mean, I can talk about this shit for 3 hours,
Yeah.
but I'm sure the audience doesn't want to hear it. So we're at an hour. I think we can go an hour and a half without abusing people. And so let's switch over to now the third category, the sandbox. And I want to leave a little bit enough time at the end to talk about what you're doing and what you're going to be doing in the future a little bit. So let's switch over now to the third type of game that we were going to talk
Yep.
about, and that's the sandbox. How would you introduce that, given the discussion we were already having about narrative styles and ways of storytelling? How would you introduce this third type of gameplay?
Well, when I was talking about Baldur's Gate and Mass Effect and how the stories are sort of technically configured, I talked about them being kind of modular, so that depending on what decisions you make, you'll get sort of a different constellation of choices from different lists of constellations. Uh, for open world games, they often use the perspective of the first and third person while making everything much, 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 much more modular in the plot. Fallout, the first two Fallouts were traditional role playing games in the vein of Baldur's Gate. Came out in
Right.
97 and 98, didn't they? Uh,
Fallout 1 and 2 is 97,
yeah.
98. That's right.
And there was no sequel for a long time, and then a company called Bethesda, which generally always does open world role playing games. That's sort of their preferred approach. Got a hold of the intellectual property and made their version of it. And their version of it took all of sort of the iconography and the aesthetics of the world and the kind of environmental storytelling that you see more often in first-person shooters in the first-person genre, and then added in the dialogue trees that you'd get in traditional role-playing games and the modular plot. So the ending changes depending on what you do. But it's much more spread out. What you're given instead of a linear corridor and instead of a linear plot is you're given like a brick of land, like several miles of land. And then at the beginning of the game, you can go anywhere and do anything. And the game system scales so that the things that you encounter don't really become more powerful until you do. Not always. They've like in the fringes of the map, they've put more powerful things. But anyway, the point is that the game systems are meant to accommodate it being played out of order. And really, there is no intended order of play for a sandbox game. So their approach to storytelling and particularly accommodating player agency is to make everything modular, to basically take the linearity out of it entirely. And as a consequence, these games very rarely have really intense main plots. Like for Fallout 3, you can actually, if you just focus on the main story missions, you can bust it out in like 2 hours. And this is a game that people routinely spend over 100 hours putting time into just one playthrough. So, excuse me, you've got 2 hours of the plot and then 98 hours of freeform interaction with the game. And that doesn't mean that there's no story in those 98 hours. There's a lot of little tiny stories, but they're all incidental and they all come up from just finding a thing or talking to a person, and it's all developed completely organically from how a player chooses to interact with it. And like it's very much a single player experience. There's no party. You don't really have companions. I mean, you can, but they're not implemented in the same way as a traditional role-playing game. It's all about accommodating player agency both within gameplay and within plot as the main deal. So like with a traditional computer role-playing game, the emphasis is still on Dungeons and Dragons style play, where you have the computer acting as an automated dungeon master, essentially. But with a sandbox game, the player is everything. Like the player is absolutely everything in a sandbox game, and the narrative is really constructed based on what you choose to do. So like everyone's playthrough is different, and on YouTube, that's why let's plays of these games, let's play is a YouTube genre where people like literally record themselves playing an entire game and post it and people watch it, and it's like, well, why would you spend so much time watching someone play a game? And it's because these games offer the opportunity to do things completely uniquely for each player. Like the story is different each time because you play it differently each time.
Yeah, yeah. So the sandbox experience is it's probably, I have to say, it's probably my favorite. If by favorite, if you indicate favorites by how many hours you put in, I think I've put in 200 hours into Fallout New
Oh God,
Vegas,
me too.
and probably about 120 into Fallout 3. Um, um, the only game I put more hours into than that is Borderlands 2, and that's just because I love that. I love the visual art style of it,
Yeah,
and the craziness of it. But um, the thing, one of the things I think, I agree with you that one of the things that makes, in a sense, the sandbox games are maximally collaborative in terms of the player getting to, in a sense, decide what the story is. Um, um, but they also succeed in being very immersive, partly because of the first person perspective, but also partly because, at least in the case of Fallout, the world is so incredibly well realized, and the history of that world is so very well conceived. Um, Fallout takes place in an alternative future, in a future that is the result of an alternative history.
yeah,
So in a sense, all the iconography is essentially 1940s and 50s
yeah.
Americana.
I actually
Um,
have a prop. This came with the collector's edition of Fallout 3. So this is there we go. Uh, this is sort of typical for the art style of Fallout, where they use kind of like the friendly watercolors of the 40s and 50s, and that sort of optimism about the future that characterizes science fiction of the time,
yeah,
and then blows it
yeah,
up. It's post-apocalyptic, so you have the remnants of all of this optimism underneath a pile of radioactive rubble, and it's so charismatic. It's such a
yeah,
charismatic juxtaposition. It's wonderful.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that, and you know, partly because the sandbox games eschew a very strong central storyline, um, and increase the sort of collaborative element, of, in a sense, make your own story. These games can now, Fallout 3 less so, but New Vegas, I think there's 9 different endings
Oh,
that you can get for New
there's
Vegas, aren't there?
so many. New Vegas is really unique because it's designed as an open world sandbox game with a lot more of the elements of traditional role playing and storytelling than like other ones. Fallout 3 is much more about gameplay than about story, and New Vegas hits this beautiful sweet spot between the two, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what New Vegas does that's so nice is that at the end, when you finish the game, it plays almost like newsreel footage
Yeah,
of that summarizes that gives a sort of an ending summary, and it literally, depending on which factions you sided with and who you fought and who you didn't fight and who you helped out and who you saved, that end newsreel changes. And I think that there are over 10 of those newsreels that you can get depending on all the different things you decided to do in the game.
well,
And if you
there's
think,
actually a lot more than 10. If you,
is there more than
I
10?
well, each one of those slides has like 5 or 6 versions. Like there's
That's
an
incredible.
insane amount of like literally minutia, like stuff that you could miss completely and then it won't appear in your slides. But like there, I think I read that there's over like 200 distinct combinations of things that you can get in the ending slides. Like
Yeah,
there's like 5 or 6 big deal ending changes, and then a ton of minor stuff that switches up depending
right,
on how you
right,
interacted.
right. So if we were to sort of, I mean, these things are they're so big and complex, they're impossible to summarize. But if you were to try to summarize from the storytelling perspective of the 3 types we've talked about, my notion is, for the first person, the Half-Life style game, the first person silent protagonist gives you maximal immersion but minimal in the story, but minimal collaboration,
Yes.
right? Um, the um, the um, the middle type, the sort of the Baldur's Gate Mass Effect type, gives you um, a moderate amount of immersion and a moderate amount of collaboration. And then the open world type, potentially, if it's really well designed and if the world is really compelling, as the world of Fallout, I think, is, can give you both maximal immersion and maximal collaboration,
Yeah,
right?
I think the best way of describing it is between linear and open world role playing games is that if you have a linear plot with like plot items 1, 2, 3, 4, if you make a branch here, then this has to accommodate these branches, and this has to accommodate both these branches, and this has to accommodate all of the branches from all three of these. But in an open world game, all of these are made distinct from one another. So the choices that you make in, plot point 1 don't actually affect plot point 2, don't actually affect plot point 3, don't actually affect plot point 4. So you've made 4 decisions, but they're not interdependent the same way a linear game is.
Right, right. And I guess if one of the things that's sort of underneath what we're talking about is, and how when I first thought about doing this topic with you, was I was thinking to myself, what what is it that video gaming can do in storytelling that can't be done in novels or films? And I think the things we've been talking about are some of those things. For one thing being, there is a level of immersion that can be realized in a video game that simply can't be realized when your engagement with the story is either by watching it on a screen or by reading it on a page. And obviously, the collaborative element is completely absent from the book reading and film watching
Yeah, it's very
experience.
much unique to games.
But maybe it's worth saying one word just in the reverse. That then begs the question: why should anybody ever read novels and watch movies again? What is it that, if you were to have to say, what is it that reading novels and watching movies can do storytelling wise that can't be done in games? What would you say?
Focus of artistic expression for sure.
Explain that a little bit.
The books only take one person to produce. Movies generally conform to the visions of a particular director, but games take dozens and dozens and dozens of people and thousands to millions of dollars to produce. So, and these things have to make their money back. So games, I think, are sort of lagging behind movies and books in terms of artistic expression, simply because they also have to succeed as products. They have to be games in addition to stories.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's both, one of the things that's really great about them, but it really does limit them. So when you read a novel, like if you read a novel in the first person, then you're really fully understanding that character's perspective on what's going on. But if you play a first person perspective, in a game, you're only experiencing however much you're personally experiencing. There's not the same sort of focus. There's not sort of the same ability to focus as books or movies. Like books and movies are really, really great at showing you something that the artist wants to see. But games,
Yeah.
on the other hand, let the consumer shape the art themselves. Like it's really
Yeah,
cool.
no, yeah, it's interesting. A thing about the artistic vision, I think, is which is part of the reason why, on the rare occasion when you get a game that does have a plot and story and characters that seem to be as well conceived and as sophisticated and beautiful as a great novel, it really stands
Yeah.
out. And I'm thinking there about Mass Effect, or where a world is created that's so compelling and interesting and well realized, as in, I think, the Fallout universe. It really stands out because you're like, wow, this really is a story almost worthy of a top
Yeah.
film or a top novel. I do think also that I would say that there is something that novels are uniquely able to do, and that is because they're not visually realized, right? Um, they allow you, there is a kind of collaboration in novels, right? In the sense that you, the reader, interpret what everything, aspect of everything is, right?
Yeah.
In other words, um, that's why the best novels are the ones that don't describe too much, right? I mean, that don't give you these laundry lists of adjectives describing
Yeah.
everything, because part of the magic of a novel is that it is collaborative in the sense that you decide what things look like. You decide, and so for example, one of the reasons that the Lord of the Rings movies, no matter how well they could be, and no matter how well they conformed to the plot and how good the acting was and everything, um, by showing you what Legolas looks like, by telling you showing you what the armors look like, which showing you, it does take away from you
Yeah.
the ability to do the ability to collaborate maybe with the novel in a way that that you normally would.
It does. Like it's important to understand that like games in no way ever could replace books or movies. They just offer a distinct set of strengths and weaknesses in terms of storytelling and presentation and sort of the flavor of the experience. Like they're also very malleable. Like you can get all sorts of different experiences from different genres of games.
Yeah.
Like it really is a medium and not a specific approach to do a game. Like it's so open-ended and so creative, and like whether it's an indie game or a AAA game, a new game will generally try to do something new and something interesting. And it's a really young medium too. You know,
Yeah.
it's only really been commercially viable for like the past 3 decades or so.
Yeah. Yeah. So in the remaining few minutes that we have, let's talk a little bit about game reviewing and about you. What made you just how did you get into game reviewing, and maybe say a little bit about the kind of game reviewing that goes on nowadays on YouTube, which has become quite a kind of a DIY kind of really standout kind of thing.
Yeah, it
Maybe you can
really
talk a
is.
little bit about how you got into it and what you see it as being.
Sure. I got into it because all my life I've worked food service, and the food service is really boring. Um, so I was working at this pizzeria for 4.5 years, and I've been doing these reviews for the past 2.5 years. And like a couple of years ago, like there was a lot of debate actually about Fallout 3 versus Fallout New Vegas. And like, oh, this game is better. Oh no, this game is better. And the
Right.
the debates I felt were really shallow and missed a lot of really obvious points about sort of the different construction philosophies behind Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. So I was like, all right, well, maybe if I capture a bunch of footage and like explain how all of these games make sense in context with one another, then this debate won't be so annoying for me. Like I'll be able to say my piece comprehensively. And so that was the first video I did. I did a retrospective of all the Fallout games and sort of how they grow in context with one another and how they change over time. And the response was really positive, and I discovered that there were a bunch of other people who had already been doing this sort of thing, not really like the whole franchise thing, but like the long-form critical look-backs. Campster, the Aaron Signal, there's an Irishman named Matthew Matosis, who's very, very popular and very gameplay-focused. It's a community of like a dozen at max people doing this, but there is a community of people doing this for at least a couple of years before I started doing it. But there's a hunger for it because with the traditional games press, there's not really the time to do these sort of extensive look back. There's a freelance writer who works for Kotaku named GB Buford, who I was talking to on Twitter a little bit. And he was saying how he wished that he could do stuff like these whole franchise lookbacks, but he's got a 3,000 word limit from Kotaku. They're like, articles over 3,000 words are really hard to sell. People don't really read them. Like, and
Kotaku, just for people who don't know, is one of the more popular gaming news and review and opinion sites on the internet.
Yeah, I actually generally really like them. I don't like all of their articles, but they've got some really fantastic writers, and they actually have a really great editorial approach, in my opinion.
Yeah. So you got into this a little bit by accident. You got into this because you were annoyed by a debate going on about two games that you loved, and so you did something. And then, what made you say, okay, I'm going to become a serious YouTube reviewer, and I'm going to keep making more, because these things are very labor intensive to make. I mean, you don't make this in 5 minutes. I mean, this is a lot of preparation, a lot of work. So what made you decide to do this now on a regular basis?
Because well, two reasons. One, because it's a way to let me really sort of pull together and like sort of formalize my thoughts on a series of games. Like I would be playing these games anyway, but this gives me an opportunity to really look at them critically, and it's really sort of changed the way that I play games, not just like the order in which I play games and sort of the clumps of games I choose to play, but it's really changed the way I look at them. Like when I play games now, I play them with much more of an eye towards how the experience is really being constructed. So like I found that really valuable, and I it's fun. It's fun to do this. It's fun to be part of something that not a lot of people are doing and that not a lot of people like want to put the time into doing. And on a purely narcissistic level, it's really nice to be something other than a pizza cook. And the response has been so positive that after a couple of years, I was able to open up a Patreon account, which is crowdfunding, which is basically employment by popular demand. It's where people who like your work contribute money on a by work or monthly basis, and I chose on a monthly basis to support what you're doing. And I'm actually making a full part-time income off of that. And a couple of months ago, I was able to quit working at the pizzeria. It was originally because I was just going to be moving and wouldn't be able to make the commute anymore. But one of the last videos that I did about Call of Duty really took off, and it doubled my crowdfunding. And it's actually starting to look like maybe it's going to be a viable thing to do. And like none of this I had any idea was going to be at the start. Like when I was doing my first Fallout video, the people at work told me, I don't think anybody's going to watch an hour-long video about Fallout. My girlfriend was like, I don't know if people are going to watch an hour-long video about Fallout. And then, like, the response to it was huge and positive, and it's fun. Fundamentally,
Yeah.
like it's the thrill of it and the intellectual satisfaction and the fact that I can do sort of a traditional academic literary criticism of games for fun and have people enjoy it is reason enough to do it.
So, actually, we could do a whole nother dialogue on on sort of what's the amazing things that this crowdfunding method of financing is making possible. And what it's really making possible is for people who are very, very good, writers, commenters, critics, etc., are enabling them to do what they do and provide it for the public and get paid for it without having to go through the traditional institutions, which have gotten to the point to which you really can't break into them unless you are already connected. And what I wanted to finish on was I also thought that you and I have now spoken several times privately before we did this. You also told me that part of the reason you did this is because it provided you a way and a platform to get out your writing, that you want to that you're a writer.
Yes.
And that your interests go beyond gaming in the area of writing. And you mentioned to me that you've also done some travel stuff, and that you want to do travel stuff. So maybe you can talk finally to close us out just about that dimension of it, the fact that this now enabled you to get your writing out into the public without having to go through all the gatekeepers of the traditional institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. It really is slipping in the back door as far as being a game critic is concerned. Basically, I started with no reputation, and I've actually grown to have a positive one because people like these videos, and that's also allowed me to do some other stuff. Like I did a 2-hour travelogue retrospective of a 4,000-mile loop of the Western U.S. I took in a 1973 Lincoln Mercury Marquis. I've had a Lincoln Continental before, but I love doing travel videos. I love travelogues in general. Like Blue Highways by William Lee Steed Moon is probably my favorite travelogue, but I've read On the Road, Bill Bryson's The Lost Continent, Travels with Charlie by Steinbeck. I'm just completely fascinated by sort of the catalog of American road literature. And the next big thing that if I can keep the crowdfunding rolling is to produce more travel content and produce travel writing, because making games videos is expensive, but I can do it in the privacy of my living room with games that I'm already playing and games that I already own. There's an expense associated with the equipment involved, but once you've got the equipment, once you've got the games, pretty cheap. But producing travel content is more expensive. You need gas and that sort of thing. But my girlfriend and I recently got for $300 a running 1973 VW bus, one of
That's
the
awesome.
Riviera campers, and it wasn't running when I bought it. Which is why it was only $300, but it just had a messed up fuel pump. That was it. So you swap in the new fuel pump and it runs pretty okay. So we're trying to put more money into it. And in a couple of years, we actually want to try to do a circuit of the US, like taking a whole year to do a really comprehensive circuit. And then I'd like to be able to do with the footage that I take on that trip, some of the same things that I've been doing with games. Because with games, really, I'm just interpreting my personal experience and trying to figure out how I came to that experience within the context of the game. And I feel like there's no reason why I wouldn't be able to do that, at large in the physical world now too. I mean, I've been doing all of these fake digital adventures my whole life, and now I finally have the opportunity to really get my hands dirty with a serious real world adventure, and I'll be able to sort of critically interpret that in the same way that I've been doing these games. So that's very exciting for me.
Well, it's exciting to me too, because I will tell you that the way you interpret your experience of the games is incredibly compelling. It's the reason why I reached out to you, because I think your programs on YouTube are some of the best I've ever
Thank
seen
you.
on gaming, and I'm really eager to see what you're going to do with a real road trip. I mean, that's just amazing. And really, really exciting. I should mention, since we're done, I do want to mention that um, people should look at the links section, because I'm going to make sure that we have links to a number of Noah's reviews and these long form reviews that we've been talking about, as well as the links with information about the games we've been talking about. And then any links that Noah wants to suggest to me, I will also include in what I send to Aria, who's the managing editor of the website. And so there'll be a lot of resources for people to check out. But more than anything else, I really strongly urge everyone who's watching to go and check out Noah's channel, because he does produce really some of the best written, most nicely narrated game reviews that I've seen.
And they're
And
mostly
Noah,
commercial free. The only videos that
that's
have
right.
commercials are the ones that got flagged for content ID because of some of the songs that happen in them.
Right. So you won't have to watch car insurance ads before you get immersed into the world of Mass Effect. Noah, I want to thank you so much for doing this with me, and I want to wish you the best of luck. I really think that you're going to go far as a writer and as a commentator, and I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it too, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you about it.
And we'll have to maybe do one in the future sometime. So take care of yourself, Noah.
Likewise, I really appreciate it. Bye.
All right. Well, I am very, very happy today to be here on Blogging Heads TV with Noah Gervais. And we are going to be talking about video gaming, but not perhaps in the way that it's typically discussed. We're going to be talking about video gaming as a form of storytelling, as a way of telling stories. And Noah certainly is somebody who knows a lot about this. So, Noah, it's typical for us to introduce ourselves before we start talking. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then I'll do the same.
Sure. I'm Noah Gervais. I produce long-form critical content about video games on YouTube, which means that I do videos that are generally 20 minutes to 2 hours in length, sort of breaking down video games. I also do travel videos, and I do it all freelance, just completely on my own, independently of anybody else.
And I am Daniel Kaufman. I'm a professor of philosophy at Missouri State University and a video game enthusiast. I should just say before we start that the way that I'm really happy to have Noah here, because I am a subscriber to his channel on YouTube, and I'm a fan of his work. And this is the reason why I asked you to do this, was because of all the video reviewers whose channels I subscribe to, and I subscribe to a number of them. Your reviews are by far the most in-depth, the most thoughtful, and are the most oriented towards the narrative and storytelling side of gaming, as opposed to a lot of the other aspects, though you do talk about those aspects too.
Thank you.
Um, so what I thought we'd start with was just the very idea of gaming and storytelling. Now, I had always thought of this. I had this sort of picture in my mind of the history of this, and so I thought, well, for a long time there were just these things called games, and games were essentially forms of competitive entertainment. And then magically in the mid 1970s, this game appeared called, but just on this particular topic. So is the idea sort of the, I mean, the idea you gave of baseball, it seems to me like the strongest element or the strongest perception of narrative and of story is from the perspective of the spectator, right? Um, but it seems to me that in would you say that also there is an element of being in a narrative for the player? Or do you think, in other words, is that the thing that's going to sort of change with Dungeons and Dragons and with the video gaming, and that is that the player now is experiencing the gaming as storytelling? Or do you think it's always been both the player and the spectator?
I I think the Dungeons and Dragons is much more collaborative than baseball. You know, baseball is a spectator sport, and the drama all comes from what other people are doing while they're actually playing the game, and that's really fun to watch and really interesting to see. But it's really only playing it that you get to experience it yourself, and you know, there's not always a lot of opportunities to do that. Like, of course, there's, you know, local intramural teams, but you never quite get the drama of baseball unless you're watching, you know, really serious players do it, or you have the opportunity to do it, which is really not that rare. It takes a lot of people to get a baseball game going. Dungeons and Dragons is less. All you have to do is like 4 or 5 or 6 people, and then video games, of course, you know, moving a little bit ahead, only take one person and then the computer to get that experience of participating in play and participating in the drama.
So you do think that in the case of like the baseball, I think your dog is very excited.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. There's not a lot I can do.
um, so you are saying that in the case of a game like baseball, the experience of a narrative or of story and of drama is experienced both by the spectators watching the game and by the players playing the game.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's the way they choose to play it, and the thrill of it is always in the interaction between, you know, sort of what can you accomplish in the game, and what specific personalities like prefer accomplishing in the game, and when you put them head to head, just what happens in the interaction of all of those things.
Right.
It's so unpredictable. Like, the systems keep the interplay between the personalities really unpredictable. Like, when you get a game with Dungeons and Dragons, like, a lot of the rule systems that, like, when you look at it from the outside, seem so silly. Like, oh, roll a d20 to open the door. Like, if you just say, oh, I opened the door, and the dungeon master says, oh yeah, okay, you open the door, you know, that there's no drama in that. There has to be a certain element of
a chance of failure.
A chance of failure. And so all of these systems in Dungeons and Dragons put systems of potential failure and consequence and unintended consequence into storytelling that might not otherwise have this random element that's so critical in like regular games.
All right, so let's since we're talking about, let's talk about Dungeons and Dragons and how things change with Dungeons and Dragons. And we really cannot assume that anyone watching this has played Dungeons and Dragons. No. Although I'm sure that there are some, but so we probably need to talk a little bit about what the game is, and what about it is different from games as they existed before. So Dungeons and Dragons, I guess, comes out around 1974, and it actually comes out of an earlier game called Chainmail, which was a purely tactical sort of game where the idea was, you know, just to sort of combat between 2 teams or several teams, or combat through a pre-made scenario where the focus was entirely on tactics and on fighting. But D&D comes out of that and in the mid 70s, and really is sort of established in the game that we now know by the late 70s. After which it then went through one sort of iteration.
The systems of the game are the things that create the drama, and then the players experience it as a participant, and the spectators experience it as a spectator. But it's the interaction of players within the system, within the game, that creates the drama, that creates these tense situations and these narrative situations.
Right. Okay, so we can already look at gaming as providing an experience that at some level is like the experience of narrative and of storytelling with drama and I guess even with characters. I mean, I was just watching. It's funny you mentioned baseball. I was a tennis player, a competitive tennis player, and I just watched last night an incredible documentary on Netflix about Jimmy Connors. I think it's called "This Is What They Want," and it was about Connors' comeback in 1991 when he was 38, 39 years old, attempt to come back and win one more U.S. Open, and he had this incredible U.S. Open run where I think he went all the way up to the semifinals, and what struck me so much was not just that there was such a story here in the sense of a narrative, but also that there were characters, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that Connors was very much a character. The people he played were very much characters, and I guess that's also true. I guess in pro sport and all other pro sports is that, and even in games like chess, right? Kasparov is definitely a
Yeah.
character, and I guess I just never thought of ordinary games that way, but now that you say it, of course, that's correct, and I guess that's a lot of the appeal, don't you think?
Oh, it's absolutely a lot of the appeal. Um, but in a lot of ways, the stories that they're telling aren't like literary stories, particularly. Like they don't have a lot of the same elements of like fiction that Dungeons and Dragons has. It's sort of all
Right.
about the personalities and all about the systems. And when you look at
Yeah.
like competitive video games like StarCraft, that's definitely the same way. There's the game, and then there's the skill of the player and like their preferences.
Dungeons and Dragons, which changed the nature of gaming and made gaming into a kind of storytelling, or introduced a kind of storytelling into gaming. But then, in a very interesting conversation you and I had, Noah, you had said that you thought that all gaming has always been in part about storytelling, and maybe you could talk a little bit about like that to start us off.
Absolutely. The example that we had talked about two examples, and I want to start off by talking about baseball in terms of narrative and drama, which is really where I learned to look at things that way. I learned it from my dad, and when he took me to Padres games when I was growing up. The thing that people love about baseball, and one of the reasons why it's such a great sport for radio, is that the rhythm of play sets up these dramatic situations with the different players, with the different like strategic elements of play. And because baseball is sort of turn-based in a way, it sets up these dramatic situations. Like when you have the bases loaded, there's an incredible amount of like narrative tension going on. Like how will the next play turn out? Like something has to happen. Similarly, chess, you get a narrative really between the two players. You have the systems in place, the systems that govern the rule of the game. And then you also have the personalities of the two players coming to bear. And especially when you look at like why people are interested in watching other people play competitive chess, it's not only watching the game itself, watching the systems of the game, it's watching these two players have, sort of an interaction and a battle and a narrative within like the context of their own skills and their own mindset. And the we think of Dungeons and Dragons as like collaborative storytelling, but there's always been drama and narrative and storytelling in any sort of game. It sets these things up simply because of the personalities working through the systems of the game.
So let me ask you just a little bit about this, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about Dungeons and Dragons.